Loki is a very old Warframe. He has been in the game since October 25th, 2012, and I have barely played him. I knew nothing about him, and I honestly thought he was useless going on what other people said about him. People were saying he's boring, or he's not that strong, he needs a rework, etc, etc. So I just took him to Void Cascade, level cap, solo, and deathless on stream. Please ignore the bad quality. Bear in mind, this was the first time I have ever properly played Loki, and I'll be honest, I did not expect that at all. I have only ever gone to level cap in Void Cascade solo with Octavia, which is not that impressive, but still Loki, and it's my first time playing him. Like, huh? So of course this has motivated me to make a guide on him to showcase how strong he actually is. You know the drill, we will go over all the abilities, synergies, builds, etc, etc. But first, a huge thank you to our channel members who helped me financially. Thank you so much for your support. Right, let's get started. Loki's passive is, well, hang on walls for 10 times longer. You take this however you want to. I think there's maybe very niche cases for this, but I guess helpful when you are invisible and want to get away from enemies. Loki's first ability is Decoy. He deploys a holographic clone of himself and draws enemy fire. This clone can be deployed within 100 meters of where you're aiming with a very high threat level, meaning it pulls a lot of aggro. The decoy will last up to 25 seconds at base. Increasing your duration will make it last longer. What makes Decoy good, besides the huge amounts of aggro it pulls, is Grineer and Corpus enemies will still try to aim at the decoy even if it's not in line of sight. So placing the decoy somewhere hidden will force enemies to just aim in its direction until it disappears. However, if you are spotted, the enemies will still focus on you. And Limbo can put the decoy in the rift, making it invincible, which is actually quite strong. Decoy has an augment called Savior Decoy. If Loki takes fatal damage, Decoy will absorb the damage and then swap places with you. It also increases the casting speed of Decoy by 50%. This mod is cool, but I haven't personally found a use for it or a playstyle for it because I like to subsume over his one. And also Savior Decoy has a 60-second cooldown, which is very long. Personally, not my favorite ability. His next ability is called Invisibility. I think you can figure this one out for yourself. You go invisible for 12 seconds at base, and of course adding duration increases this. This is where Loki beats Ash in the Invis department. He gets very nice invisibility duration when you scale it. The augment is called Hushed Invisibility, makes all your weapons silent when you're invisible. Pretty self-explanatory. His third ability is Switch Teleport. You swap positions with a target, making them confused. At base, this goes up to 75 meters. You can also do this to allies. It does require line of sight. You can switch teleport with your own decoy. And what is cool about this ability is it has niche cases where you can switch teleport with drones for bounties, for the Plague Star event, bosses, corpses, and other decoys like Saren's Molt. You can also switch with downed teammates as well. But the augment is what I love about this ability most. Safeguard Switch. Loki briefly becomes invulnerable when switching with enemies or allies. This gives your allies invulnerability and cleanses status effects. 3 seconds for an enemy and 6 seconds for an ally. This will scale with duration. What's so amazing about this is the duration of the invulnerability can be refreshed while active, meaning you can be permanently invulnerable. The only thing is, when the invulnerability is active, status effects can still be applied to you after the teleport, but when the invulnerability runs out, it will do the remaining damage to you. So you can just recast this to refresh the period and cleanse the status effects. There is no cooldown on this ability, so stacking a lot of duration will make Loki pretty much invulnerable. His next ability is also really amazing. It's called Radial Disarm. Send forth a wave of energy, forcing enemies to drop their ranged weapons and resort to melee combat. This ability right here is one of the nicest CC abilities in Warframe. It has a base radius of 20 meters before adding range mods. This ability doesn't stop enemies from using abilities that don't require a gun or melee weapon. Radial Disarm also permanently forces Ospreys to the ground, but the augment again makes this ability amazing, and that is called Irradiating Disarm. This augment will force the enemies to be affected by radiation, but it's a bit weird. It's not actually radiation. When you cast it, you'll see that there's no radiation procs. This is because they are actually affected by the confusion status and not actually radiation, meaning condition overload does not affect the status effect. This augment forces enemies to resort to melee and proceed to kill each other, meaning barely enemies will focus on you. Adding duration will increase the time for this effect, although if you want to renew the duration, you have to wait for the duration to run out entirely, then recast Radial Disarm. Like I said, one of the best CC abilities in Warframe. And that is Loki's abilities and augments explained. Now I want to talk about Loki's strengths and weaknesses before, so we can get a better understanding as to why we build him the way we do. Loki is inherently a stealth frame, designed to dodge and evade. None of his abilities offer you outright massive amounts of damage or damage mitigation to make him somewhat tanky, without his augments for his teleport, of course. And none of his abilities directly buff your weapons. His whole kit is designed to get away, confuse, and crowd control. In Warframe, sometimes this is not as desirable in the current meta because, well, it's Warframe. You just want to annihilate everything in your path, but personally, I don't think it's that bad, because what this means is all of your abilities are focused on keeping you alive, so you are going to need to use a good weapon to kill your enemies fast, otherwise it's not going to be too much fun playing Loki. Especially when pairing Safeguard Switch and Irradiating Disarm, it will keep you alive a lot longer, but you still need to be able to kill the enemies quickly. For the newer players or the Star Child players, would it be worth it for you to get Loki? Meh, so-so. He's a really good stealth frame for Spy and the Star Chart. If you're wanting to play an invisible frame early, then he's a really good pick. If you're a fan of CC and the whole confusing enemies playstyle while being super slippery, then you will enjoy him. But remember, you do need to make sure that whatever weapon you're using, it's going to be good enough to kill the enemies fast, otherwise you just won't have the greatest time with him. However, Loki really shines when you start to former him and add augments, Archon shards, and just start using really strong weapons in the later game. When it comes to building Loki for the early game though, well, it's pretty easy. Loki doesn't need strength for his abilities. He mainly relies on duration and range. With this in mind, you can use simple mods like continuity or stretch in the very beginning. All you need for him are these 4 mods and whatever aura you have available. We build him this way because you want to be invisible as long as possible, and we also need a bit of range for when you cast Radial Disarm, and if you would like more range, the switch teleport. I personally don't like his decoy, although it has some insane aggro pool. It's best to place his decoy behind cover, or if you cast Radial Disarm, it forces all the enemies to go to melee, and then you can just cast decoy on top of an object where the enemies can't get to the decoy. So more duration will keep the decoy alive longer. If you are struggling with energy sustain, then slot in Streamline if you have the capacity for him. If you are willing to put more former in and a catalyst, then you can add auger mods to increase the range and duration further. And that's how you play him as a beginner. Focus on invisibility and Radial Disarm. When it comes to using him for missions, like I mentioned, Spy would be really good for him as he is a stealth frame, or you can just use him for whatever mission you would like. If we move on to the late Star Chart players or base Steelpath, then you can use this simple budget build here with a few corrupted mods. But here we run both augments. These 2 augments are my favorite way to play Loki, as we rely on the invulnerability from Safeguard Switch and the crowd control from Irradiating Disarm. It's a really nice playstyle and allows you to be tankier while the enemies basically ignore you. If you're in late Star Chart, you won't have access to Rolling Guard unless you buy it with Platinum, so this only applies to early Steelpath. Just use whatever mod you have available here. This is a no Helminth setup, just basic Loki with a simple build. The aura and arcanes or whatever you have available. My suggestion though is Arcane Eruption for that insane crowd control and Molt efficiency for more duration. Now we move on to the end game playstyles with min-max setups. These are for those of you who can afford a whole bunch of former and have primed mods. The first build we have is the one that I use to go to level cap solo with him, and that is using silence over his first ability. The entire goal of this setup is to crowd control the enemies so much they barely even hit you, which is why it was relatively easy to get to level cap with him. Silence as a subsume is becoming one of my favorite abilities. This ability basically nullifies enemies and prevents them from using any abilities on top of the stun it already gives you when the enemies are in range. Silence comes in really handy against Thraxes in Void Cascade, because then they can't use any abilities which are very, very strong. We focus on a lot of duration and a bit of range, so that we have a 31-second invisibility and a 7-second invulnerability time, which gives us ample leeway to recast it and just stay invulnerable. On top of the CC from Silence, we have Irradiating Disarm, which means the enemies just ignore you. To add the cherry on top, we use Arcane Eruption for even more knockdown. This setup is a joke when it comes to late game Steelpath. The enemies just don't get a chance to hit you for the most part. Nullifiers are still your worst enemy after all though. This is by far my favorite, and I think it makes Loki quite fun to play. If you're wanting to run a more budget version of this with silence, obviously if you don't have prime sure-footed, then use something else and just run the normal variants of the primed mods. Anything endurance with a good weapon will be a breeze with this Loki setup. I honestly did not realize how powerful he was until I tried this. We then have a Radial Disarm focused playstyle, which is lower duration and focuses on pure range. The Helminth option is flexible here. However, when it comes to adding a Helminth for Loki, you're going to have to sacrifice the full focus on duration or range and go a bit more strength, depending on the Helminth you subsume. So you can adjust the builds accordingly depending on the Helminth slot. Some good options would be Nourish, Roar, Zarta's Whisper, or Eclipse. Eclipse would work well because you can go invisible, effectively keeping the damage boost up. But of course, you would just focus on less duration and more strength then. And then Gloom would not be a bad pick. The best arcanes for Loki are Molt Efficiency, Molt Augmented, Arcane Agility, Arcane Eruption, and Arcane Energize, and any weapon damage buffing arcanes like Rage or Fury, etc. When it comes to Archon shards, for those of you in Steelpath, casting speed ×2 is really nice, duration shards, and parkour velocity. Just to add this quickly, I do have a Decoy setup, which I don't particularly like this build because save your Decoy has a 60-second cooldown, so I don't know, it's just meh. But if you want to try a Decoy setup, then this one works. Overall, the silence build is the best in my opinion, especially in the late game. I would never have guessed that he would be that strong. The Radial Disarm focus build is also really fun if you just want rooms of enemies to get CC'd. I know people say his playstyle is a bit boring, which I can understand. He's not super aggressive, you're not going to see groups of enemies being deleted from his abilities, but I think it's a nice change of pace to play him every now and then. I think overall he's a decent frame, but I will admit for general missions there are frames out there that can do what he does but better. He's an old frame, he does need a rework to some degree. I will say he is worth it if you're trying to do endurance runs for higher level content. I personally didn't find him boring, but I was playing solo Void Cascade, which I don't think any frame is boring when it comes to that because it's extremely stressful and I thoroughly enjoyed it. If you are interested in the loadout I did use the Smeeter, but don't use Smeeter. Use Worm with Negate or Nautilus for CC. The Silence build for Loki I used, and then the Felox, a Kuva Nuke or Primer, and then the Glaive Prime. And then I used Anaru for armor stripping. That's my thoughts on Loki. Really took me by surprise. I don't have anything more to say about him. He's really fun in high level content. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.